So door is closing, your flight's about to take off. And what we're going to talk about is, I have a very fancy title here, WCAG 2.1 Stratification to support gamification of accessibility training by role. Okay? What does that mean? That means make it fun and make it relevant. Okay, but that wasn't as good of a title, so I used this title instead. I am the head of accessibility for VMware, as I mentioned, the largest software company half of you in this room have never heard of, but we have 27,000 employees. We are everywhere. We just aren't particularly well known by end users. And I'm previously the head of accessibility for McDonald's, which you probably have heard of. And so people ask me, what is the 3 most important things in a good accessibility program? And my answer is, number 1, training, number 2, training, number 3, more training. The problem is everybody hates compliance training. You know, go back to the last time you switched jobs, especially if you went to work for a large company, and you go in and immediately there's like these 6 mandatory compliance training sessions on data privacy and on, you know, not harassing people and what we're now euphemistically referring to as resilience training, which ironically says that I'm supposed to run if there's an active shooter in our building, which is not really possible. But the point of this is that everybody hates compliance training, okay? Contrast that against training is the most important thing about accessibility. And so what you run into is something that can be improved through gamification. And so gamification has several elements. User engagement is really important, giving people rewards for training. So basically you're triggering that dopamine response of, ooh, you know, I'm the best at something, or ooh, I won something. Making the training motivating, them actually learning something is kind of the byproduct of all of this. And creating this thing more as a challenge that can be accomplished rather than, you know, a series of 1-hour videos where you're droning on and on about the 50 different requirements for WCAG and accessibility. And I'm not a PDF specialist. PDF is part of my accessibility domain at VMware. It was also part of my accessibility domain at McDonald's. So for example, we changed our PDF generation engine at McDonald's to generate accessible nutrition information online so that every time we updated an ingredient, we didn't have to have somebody manually tinkering with the PDF file. It pulled it straight out of the database. So that it is something that I've worked on in the past, but I'm definitely not the PDF wonk that the gentleman who spoke before me was, and I mean that in the most complimentary sense possible. So there are a whole lot of statistics that I'm giving you here that you can pull out of this document to make the argument about how turning training into a game really actually makes sense. First of all, the industry is enormous, okay? And there's links to all the resources in here, okay? Execs play games, more than half of them, on a regular basis, once a day. So this isn't gonna be a concept that's foreign to them because it's something that they do already. They're either playing Words with Friends on the subway or they're playing Candy Crush, or as my husband does, Pokemon Go with our children. 70% of Global 2000 companies have at least one gamified application. It's not always in training, but they've got at least one. Learners like this, okay? They think that they would be more productive and learn more if they were presented things in more of a gaming format than in a traditional format. And they're also very motivated by leaderboards. Who doesn't try harder when they see that they're in 6th place to get up to 5th place so that their name shows up for everybody to see that they're one of the top 5 in a particular area? Engagement is really important. There are 350 companies, including Adobe, who have launched major gamification projects, and there are a lot of gamers in the US. I mean, this is a global solution, but more than half of the US are gamers, and they're playing 13 hours a week on average, okay? Probably most of them are playing Fortnite, and I'm not describing games necessarily in terms of Fortnite for this, but just things that convey the same information but make it fun. And I got this idea And I want to give proper thanks to Denis Boudreau, who wrote an article about Christmas time at the end of last year about how to make accessibility more interesting for designers and UI and UX people. And there were two really important points in this article, and I put a link in here so that you can find it easily. One was accessibility heuristics. You need to be able to make it easy to apply common sense and learn what is, quote unquote, good enough, like our keynote speaker was talking about today. But there were a few things that were missing from Denis' article. It was a great starting point, okay, and it triggered my thoughts about this, but there were three things that I thought were missing. One is it was based on WCAG 2.0. It didn't include the 2.1 update. For those of you who are WCAG fluent in here, there are 17 new guidelines in WCAG 2.1. Most of them pertain to mobile, so they might not be super relevant to PDF. But the upcoming categories of things that I've broken them down into applies to web pages and mobile apps as well. It doesn't have a specific PDF focus. The second thing that I thought was missing was a point of view. UI people don't care about the same thing as UX people. UX people don't care about the same thing as coders. Coders don't care about the same thing as document production or content managers. Remember, you can have a perfectly accessible infrastructure and somebody can completely hose it by deploying new content that's inaccessible without ever touching the system code. So I honestly think sometimes that content developers and there's a lot of overlap between the content people and the PDF people. They are the most important people to train. They have the lowest level of education, technical education usually, and so that means they know the least amount about accessibility. And they are the ones that are going to be in there every day tweaking stuff. Where the coders, when they're done. They roll off that project, they roll on to a different project. Same thing with UI and UX people. So applying points of view to the WCAG categories is something that will give you something that's more targeted and more relevant to the job description. And finally, fun. There needs to be a way to make accessibility fun. I happen to have a personal interest in people with disabilities, not specifically because of my own situation, but because I have a daughter who's deaf. And that's actually how I got into accessibility in the first place. About half of the people in accessibility either have a disability or they're connected closely to somebody with a disability, a family member, a really close friend, or something like that, okay? You don't have to worry about their engagement because they're always going to be engaged because of their personal motivation. Okay, but the other people and the people that are supporting you out in the field that actually have to implement things in an accessible manner, they don't have that same personal connection. And so by making it fun and engaging and a little competitive, you might be able to trigger more engagement with those employees or contractors. Okay, so there are multiple points of view. You can be talking about travel and one person's automatically thinking, ooh, what can I look at? And one person's thinking, oh, I wonder if I have enough room in my suitcase. And the next person's, not looking at anything except through the lens of a camera. I swear to God, I was in Versailles a couple of summers ago. I was the only person who was looking at stuff. Everybody else had their iPads in front of their faces as they were taking videos of things. And then finally, one group of people might think, where are we going next? And so that's one of the reasons why I think splitting it up by points of view and not just by WCAG categories, that way you're getting the siloed approach, but you're also getting the horizontal specific dicing of the data. So you're giving each employee exactly the data that they need to learn, and you're trying to do it in a fun manner. Okay, so going into the 10 categories, and each of these guidelines is linked to the WCAG language. I actually have in all of my jobs, not just my current one, I put in what I want the English interpretation to be on a Confluence page, because reading WCAG is like reading regulatory language, and you want to make sure that everybody's interpreting it the same way. What does meaningful text mean? What does incidental mean? Providing that information in English makes it easier that everybody's going to be rowing in the same direction. So the first group of, and there are 11 groups here, by the way, that we're going to be going over. So let me step back here for a second. I probably should have put an introduction slide before this section. You can learn the 50 different guidelines of WCAG 2.1 AA, or you can learn 11 groups and why those 11 groups are important. If you learn the 11 groups, it will be less stuff to memorize, because memorizing 50 things is like memorizing the 50 capitals of the 50 states. You remember doing that in 5th grade if you went to school in the US. And you immediately dump that information out of your brain as soon as you pass the quiz, right? We want people to retain this information. And one of the ways of making people retain the information is explaining why. Not just that alt text is important, not just what alt text is, but why is it that people need alt text, and how do they use it, and what are they missing if they don't have it? What is the impact on the people with disabilities? Because if you haven't worked with somebody who's blind before, you might not understand screen readers, and you might not understand the importance of having that information. And so in all of my training materials, there's always English, and there's always why. Those are the two most important things, I think, in conveying all of this information. And if you know the 11 groups and you understand the why behind the group, it doesn't matter if you know that 2.46 is the heading requirement in WCAG, because you know why headers are important to people with disabilities and how they use them. So the first category is keyboard operation. This is mostly just for if you're doing web pages and mobile apps, which is a lot of what I do. This doesn't apply so much to PDF files. There's not a lot of things that the content people can do to make the keyboard operate in a different manner. But you have to work with the keyboard. Keyboard is the underlying requirement for all accessibility. If you do not work with a keyboard, you don't work for screen reader users, you don't work for users with cerebral palsy, you don't work for users with Parkinson's, or anybody that has either hand control issues or a missing limb or missing digits for any reason, or even arthritis. I don't use a mouse because I've got arthritis. I only work off of a keyboard. Second requirement, no keyboard traps. We call this the Roach Motel requirement. If you can get to it from a keyboard, you need to be able to get out of it from a keyboard, because your only alternative is resetting your browser or resetting the PDF file or the app or whatever it is, and nobody likes doing that. For somebody who's blind, and I've timed it, for advanced users, it takes them 12 to 15 minutes to recover from a keyboard trap. They have to figure out they're in the keyboard trap, they have to reset the environment, and then they have to get back to where they were in the first place. Character key shortcuts. No Control-Alt-Delete, print screen F2. Because not everybody has that many fingers, and not everybody has that much coordination. Another one is don't reuse keyboard shortcuts that mean something else. Don't reuse Control-C. Okay, everybody knows that means copy. Don't reuse Control-V. Everybody know, Control-Z, et cetera, et cetera. Focus order and keyboard focus indicator. So my one contribution to WCAG 2.1, it was my pet peeve for 2.0 for a long time, was that a keyboard focus indicator was required, but there was no visual contrast rules about it. So my graphical designers used to make like really 1 pixel thin blue on blue and go, look, I did your keyboard focus indicator. And it was totally unusable to somebody who was having difficulty seeing due to magnification. So those are the keyboard requirements. Other operations include supporting hitting the escape key to cancel something. And a really important one that gets missed a lot of time and can only be picked up through manual testing is this on-focus requirement, which is mostly shopping cart kind of oriented. If I have a shopping cart and I have 2 bags of Oreos in my shopping cart and I decide to delete one of those bags, what happens? Well, I'm not going to have as many snacks to pass around, but the price will update, right? Perhaps a coupon that you had used earlier that was good for 2 bags of Oreos is no longer valid. Perhaps you have dropped below the minimum that's allowed for delivery to your house. So all of those things happen as a result of you performing the operation of deleting, removing one of the bags of Oreos from your shopping cart. If you are blind, you only know that those things happen because the screen reader told you that they happened. Otherwise, you've got no visual context for seeing all of those things that changed on the screen. And timeouts is really important. And if you're ever working just on the HTML side of the world, it takes 3 to 5 times longer for somebody with a disability to fill out a form or process data as it does for somebody without a disability. And so they need longer timeouts. If you're using a head switch on a wheelchair, you're going like this a lot. Sometimes you need breaks. If it's a really long form, you need to step away from it, go have a drink of water, give your neck a break, but you don't want all that data lost just because you needed a break. So adjustable timeouts with really long extensions are super important to people with disabilities. So navigation, now we're finally getting to PDF because link text is something that appears in PDF files. Click here is not useful information to somebody who's blind. What you need to do is you need to provide more information to the announcement, and you can do that through hidden text on an HTML page. The recommended way to do it is using ARIA. To tell people, click here for the nutrition information on double quarter pounder with cheese, for example. Okay. Some of the requirements for HTML are bypass blocks, providing multiple ways of getting to things. Table of contents are essential for long PDF files for people who are blind. If they know what they want is on page 20, they want an easy way to get to page 20. They don't want to have to sit there and listen for the first 19 pages to announce. And the final requirement for navigation is what I call the duh requirement: make things consistent, okay? Always put the close button and the OK button, keep consistent what side each is on. Keep the little X box for your dialogues in the same locations. If you've got a menu, keep the items in the same order. Okay. Rule of thumb, if it's a bad experience for a person with no disabilities, it's going to be an atrocious experience for a person with disabilities. Okay, the next one, and we're starting to get into more PDF content things here, is structure. So if I see a picture and text next to it, visually I associate those two. Okay, but in reality, there's nothing really connecting those two items. And so if I'm blind and I'm going from text, text section to text section, I might not even pick up the fact that the pictures are there because there's no relationship between the information. You actually have to physically establish that relationship in HTML pages. Page titles are really important for HTML pages because people who are blind, and I do harp a lot about blind, not because blindness is the only disability, but for my deaf daughter, if you want to make her happy, you caption, right? She's done, and you move on to the next thing. 28 of the 50 WCAG requirements pertain to screen reader use. And the reason why they do is it's just really, really hard to take something that's visual and make it work for somebody who can't see. And so people who are blind use page titles and use header structure to reinforce that they are where they should be and to skip from block to block of information without having to sit there and listen to the screen reader announce it all. I have a friend who runs his screen reader at 425% normal speech. I've been able to use a screen reader for 8 years, and I cannot understand what it's saying. But my friend Kevin can execute with his Braille note taker and with his speech setting at 425%, can execute a Google query faster than I can. So that understanding that how people can fine-tune their own environments and how they process data is really important. Now, he's congenitally blind. There's a big difference between people with congenital disabilities and people with acquired disabilities. Somebody who loses their vision suddenly in their 30s due to retinitis pigmentosa or early onset macular degeneration or even an injury. One of the people that I use sometimes in my focus group had a gunshot wound to the head and it severed his optic nerve and he went blind. He went from being a regular 21-year-old to blind overnight. Acquired disabilities, you look at them psychologically differently. You look at them like, I had this and I lost it. And it takes them a while to pick up the assistive technology and to develop the coping mechanisms to figure out how to work around that loss. People look at me and they're like, don't you miss, being able to run a marathon? Don't you miss skiing? And I'd be like, why? I've never been able to do it in the first place. This is congenital. This has been my life. So, and I've had, 50x years to develop my coping mechanisms. So I'm totally fine with it. But people with acquired, and most vision issues are acquired. They're not congenital. Also, there's 5 times as many magnification users as screen reader users. So you need to think about them as well. You can't just think, it's not all about screen readers. Okay. Role state value, I'm trying to think if there's going to be an application for that in PDF, but I'm not coming up with one off the top of my head. And reflow, typically also not a PDF problem because when you load a PDF on a mobile device, the mobile device is handling how that's presented. Info and relationships might actually have a PDF link, and that link would be tables. Okay, so if you've got a table and you've got a table cell in it, and the table cell says 9, okay, that information to a blind person is not useful. If it says 9 grams of fat chicken McNuggets because you have associated the cell header and the row header with the cell, then that's going to be useful information. So, but you have to do that yourself. That doesn't come automatically. Color, most of you probably know the color requirements. This is actually probably the most well-known. And there is a new color requirement in WCAG 2.1 for those of you who aren't familiar with it, which is there's a contrast minimum now for non-text elements. The non-text elements are keyboard focus indicator, yay, go Sheri, and activatable icons. So they have to meet the large text requirement, which is 3.01, which means about 17% of color combinations are going to be disallowed. But that leaves you 83%. I mean, designers, I love that screenshot. I put it to the Slack message for the designers at my team where it said how to give designers, how to piss them off and give them a migraine. Same thing, they'll complain about the 17% that get taken away from them, but I'm like, dude, you've got 83% left. Make the most of what you've got, because you don't want to put something out there that people can't see. Don't put red on green. Especially for VMware, because we're an IT company, 6.5% of our user base is colorblind, because it's an 80-20 split between men and women, approximately, in the IT field, if I'm overgeneralizing a little bit here, but you kind of have to do it with those populations. And 4.25% of the population is colorblind to begin with, but we have even more colorblind people because of the predominance of men in IT. So you need to think about your audience when you're choosing colors. If you know you're going to especially have a lot of men, don't use red and green together ever, even if you manage to get it to slip by the WCAG requirements for some reason. It's just not going to be a good experience. And there was one NFL football game where they changed the jerseys, and they had one team with red numbers on a gray background and one team with green numbers on a gray background, and it became a meme because somebody ran it through a color blindness simulator and said, hey, your audience is mostly men, and here's what 4.25% of them are seeing, and all the uniforms look the same to somebody who is colorblind. You don't want to be a meme. Okay, 5th category is legibility. That legibility goes back to our magnification users. My dad's 86, he zooms everything. You need to be able to resize the text. Preferably, WCAG does not mandate anything pertaining to font families. Don't use serif fonts, okay? Serif fonts are insert your favorite bad word here, for people with dyslexia to be able to read. 5 to 7% of your population, your reader population, is going to have dyslexia. So while it's not mandatory, it is a best practice to only use sans serif fonts and to make it so that they zoom appropriately. Don't have them overflow their containers. Don't embed text and images, because when you embed text and images, it pixelates and it looks like crap to people who have zoomed up to 400% magnification, which is the test that you're supposed to run for WCAG. So running out of time. This presentation usually takes about an hour, so I'm going to quickly skip through the next 6 categories and not go into them in any level of detail. You can grab me in the hallway if you have any specific questions, and you'll get the deck and the PDF file from Duff. Announcements, you need to set the language of the page, okay? The default language for NVDA, which is one of the most popular screen readers, the default accent is Australian, because it's an Australian charity. Okay, nobody likes to hear Spanish announced with an Australian accent. Me llamo Jose. So make sure you're setting your language. That's one of the 6 very basic requirements for a PDF file. And if you have a word that's in a different language and you want to be super awesome about it, like let's say the word voila appears in your otherwise English file, set that word to French, and it will get announced with the correct accent. And that sends a subconscious message that you actually give a damn. Okay, it's not just about whether or not it's a better experience. The screen reader will hear that, and they will understand this person took enough care with this to make that change, to make it a better experience for me. Okay, forms, super important. You have to tell people what goes in the field. You have to tell them whether or not it's required. You have to label it. And it has to be a good label, not field 1, field 2, field 3. Why? Voice operation, okay? iOS 13, people will be able to fill forms through their voice, and you need to be able to say, in the address field, enter blah, 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 blah. They don't know that you've named it field 3, okay? So make sure you're using appropriate names that make sense for your fields. And the on input requirement is the counterpart to the on focus requirement that we discussed earlier. Let's say you input your zip code and a delivery charge comes up. You need to tell the person that happened. So that's the same requirement as on focus, just in different contexts. Labels and instructions. Okay, I'm down to 5 minutes. Explaining that things are mandatory or optional, really important. You don't want to do all fields required. Why? I get a lot of crap from designers about that. So if you have something at the top that says all fields required and you zoom, you're going to lose that instruction, and the person's not going to realize that all the fields are required. So really, you do need to mark them, preferably to the left of the label, because then the restriction will be announced on the screen reader before you go into the field. It's just a better experience. Error handling, there are a bunch of requirements. There's a new requirement in WCAG that if you're doing a status message, that the status message has to be announced whether or not it gets focus. Okay, so it used to be that only things that got focus were announced. That created all kinds of focus management issues. Now it's just a rule that if you're giving somebody a warning or an error or anything like that, like they're doing a PDF form and they're doing a submit from the form, you have to tell them all of the messages so that they pick them up. If you're going to embed a video, for God's sakes, closed caption it. Duff was talking to me earlier, and he said the most recent article I did on captioning was lethal. And I said, well, you know what? As the mom of somebody who's deaf, I've run out of F's to give for anybody's excuse for not closed captioning. It's $1 a minute. Just do it. And then finally, motion. The one I'll highlight because I'm running out of time is the flashing threshold. Don't load videos into your PDF files that have flashing in them, because that can trigger a seizure and somebody could actually get seriously injured. This is the one requirement in WCAG that if you don't follow it, you could actually kill somebody. There are flashing threshold seizure simulation tools out there for free. You can run your MP4 through it. If it passes, great, go ahead and put it up. If it fails, just say no. Okay, so back to the gamification in the context of all of these categories and WCAG things that I've just described. How do you do user engagement, rewards, achievement, motivation, learning, and challenges in presenting this material? So for Just a few examples here. You can have a Jeopardy-like game where random questions of increasing levels of difficulty about one of the particular accessibility guidelines. Speed, who's the fastest to enter 10 pieces of good alt text? Accuracy, look at a page, maybe like a Jackson Pollock kind of art piece, and pick out, without using the contrast analyzer, that's the important part, any color combinations that you think might fail the contrast ratio checker. After you've done it 10 or 12 times, you can tell most of the time just by looking at it. My now 16-year-old, when she was 12, when ads came on TV, she would go, "Mom, that's not going to pass the color contrast test, is it?" And I would say, "Yeah, yes," or "Yeah, no." But if a 12-year-old with absolutely no professional training can figure it out, you guys are going to be able to figure it out as well. And that is kind of the end of the discussion. So in terms of tools that are out there, there are gamification systems that you can license very inexpensively. I always recommend something that works on mobile, because then people can do the training when they're on the subway or when they're at the doctor's office, in little 5-minute nugget-sized chunks. Unfortunately, the downside is that most of the training that I've seen so far is not accessible. You can deploy it to a mobile environment. It doesn't work particularly well with a screen reader, but chances are the people that you're going to be training aren't blind. Okay, so because if you're blind, you don't need the training. You already know from your life experience what it takes to make something accessible. So I'm kind of letting that one slide for a while, although I am hounding all the vendors that I meet with that it would be really good if training on accessibility was accessible. What a concept. And I do write a lot about accessibility. My Medium blog is listed here. I'm always happy to have more readers, more ideas for articles, whatever. So thank you very much.